Hello, fellow travellers, and welcome to episode number 14 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sarah Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. It is, in truth, not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. It is with these powerful words that a mostly forgotten 1320 documents from Scotland came into the limelight at the end of the 17th century, and it's still central in Scotland's history to this day. Written as a private letter, it's now known as the Declaration of Arbroath. And it is with these words that I would like to welcome you, my fellow travellers, onto another historical path today. We've left the sun of both Greece and Persia, and we've travelled north once again, up to the top portion of the British Isles. Here lies a country whose inhabitants dissuaded even the Romans from conquering them. Freedom is a fundamental human desire, and humans stop at nothing to grasp it. Wars have been waged throughout history. Heroes have been born under the banner of liberty, like the man on whose path we're travelling today. When King Edward I of England, the Hammer of the Scots as he was known, tried to bend Scotland to his will, the Scottish people did not accept their fate lying down. They rallied together, following a powerful leader, fighting for their freedom. Two were the men who rose to the challenge, two the banners under which the Scots marched to regain their independence. We will see both of them in this and in the next episode, for their names are inextricably linked with the history of the country. A noble and a commoner, a king and a general. They both aspired to be the hammer of the English. To both, Scotland owes its freedom. In this episode, we'll follow the general. His story is unfortunately brief, his moment of glory quickly overshadowed by his defeat. Even so, his name is eternal. I welcome you, my fellow travellers, onto the path of William Wallace. Despite being a significant figure in Scottish history and a world-renowned hero, especially after the 1995 movie Braveheart, there isn't much historical certainty on the events of his life. His existence is not in doubt, nor his deeds for that matter, but most of his life and actions are beset by myths and contradictions. If we were to base ourselves only on proven facts recorded in contemporary and near-contemporary chronicles, there wouldn't be enough to make a podcast episode, let alone a biography on the man. And yet, in spite, or maybe exactly because there aren't so many proven stories about him, William Wallace has become the undoubted, undisputed hero of the Scottish Wars of Independence, so much so that the idea of Scottish patriotism has been associated to his name ever since. His rise to power, fame and glory was done in answer to the plight of his own people, forced to live under the heel of their southern neighbour, England. What had happened to bring the proud Scotland down so low? The root of all their troubles can be found in a dark and stormy night in 1286. This had been the last night of Alexander III, King of Scotland. As the curtains were about to close on his life, the king had been ruling Scotland for almost 30 years. Despite having had 3 children from his first queen, 2 princes and a princess, in 1286 he was left without any direct successor. They had all died within 3 years of each other, leaving Alexander III's only granddaughter, Margaret of Norway, a child of 7, as the only one carrying his blood. To ensure a direct succession, the king had remarried in 1285. Yolande de Reux was a young girl of 22, so it was expected of her to get pregnant quickly and secure the succession for Alexander III's line. In March 1286, though, the queen had yet to announce a pregnancy, but the king, despite being 44 years of age, wasn't particularly worried. The kingdom was at peace, and while he didn't expect to be around forever, I assume he must have thought that, without a war on the horizon, he had enough time to father any number of heirs for his crown. Nobody had foreseen what happened in reality. It was a stormy night in the middle of March, when Alexander III decided to visit the Queen at Kinghorn in Fife, probably to celebrate her birthday with her. He had been staying at Edinburgh Castle that night, overseeing a meeting with his royal advisers. When he announced he was going out, he was cautioned against it. The night was dark and there was a storm, so his advisers suggested he waited until morning to make a trip. The king ignored the advice and set out anyway. At the crossing of the River Forth, he was once again cautioned by the boatman not to cross the clearly swollen river, and yet the king insisted, and the boatman obliged. On the other side of the river, the nobles of the town pleaded with the king as well for him not to continue the voyage. Apparently, Alexander III was no stranger to this pilgrimage in the dark, because one of the burgesses, Alexander Le Saucier, is said to have bluntly told the king, and I quote, "How many times have I tried to persuade you that midnight travelling will do you no good?" I imagine that Alexander III might have laughed at all the clucking mother hens around him, as he, once again, ignored their advice to stop for the night and pushed forward in the storm. What happened next, nobody knows. The king became separated from his party as they had almost arrived at their destination, and was found dead with a broken neck the following morning. All sources seem to agree that this was an unlucky accident. The horse had lost its footing in the dark. As Scotland plunged into chaos, William Wallace was enjoying his childhood in obscurity as the cadet son of a minor nobleman. Historians are not sure about the years of his birth, as the date has been stated in various chronicles as anywhere between 1260 and 1278. Traditionally, he is said to have been the son of Sir Malcolm Wallace, a minor nobleman from Renfrewshire in Scotland. There might be also another possibility, though. Historians have found one single example of what is thought to have been William Wallace's seal. On it, there are the words Wilhelmus Filius Alani Wallace, William son of Alan's Wallace. Yet another mystery surrounding his character. Young William Wallace, living his boyhood in the countryside, would probably have been quite unaware of the political situation of the country. If we consider his date of birth around 1272, which is the latest date proposed by the historians, then young Wallace would have enjoyed at least a decade of peace and prosperity before Alexander III's death. It is interesting to note that about the time of his birth, King Henry III of England died, and was succeeded by the man who would become Wallace's arch-enemy later on, Edward I the Longshanks, so called because he was considerably above average height. But it wasn't just the new King of England who quite literally towered over his subjects. Wallace himself would develop quite a sturdy frame, attaining a final height of 2 meters with a muscular physique. He wasn't just physically well built, though. According to the chronicles, he also possessed considerable mental faculties. All things considered, especially given his position as a second son, it isn't so far-fetched to imagine that he might have been destined to either the battlefield or the church. We have no certainty, but we do know that he did carry around a psalter, which would suggest a more religious education, and he was taught horsemanship and martial skills, which would come quite handy in his later life. He specialized himself in the wielding of the claymore. It was said that Wallace could swing the heavy two-handed weapon with enough force to slash even armor. It was, all things considered, quite a standard life for the period. At some point, when Wallace was about 15-year-old, it seemed clear that his future path would be that of the church, and he was sent to an uncle who started to teach him Latin and classical authors. And then Alexander III died, leaving only his grandchild as his successor. 6 guardians had been nominated to be the regents until Margaret reached majority, but unfortunately for her, she would not survive the journey from Norway to Scotland, dying on Scottish soil as she was just 7. Her death opened up the race for the throne. The Great Cause, as it became known, provided Edward I, King of England, with a perfect opportunity to extend the reach of his power into the north. In the end, John Balliol, Lord of Galloway, thanks to English backing, emerged victorious from the race and accessed the throne. His first act as a ruler was to give homage to Edward I, and with this, Scotland was effectively under England's command. This was Edward I's political triumph. He tried to control Scotland by marrying his heir to young Margaret, but the plan had to be scrapped at her death. Now he could rule through a puppet, John Balliol. Angered and disgusted by the cowardice of their king and their nobles, the people of Scotland decided to take the initiative, escalating brawls and riots into ambushes and reprisals against the English soldiers. It is in one of these skirmishes that William Wallace's father was killed. He, like many other Scotsmen, had not wanted to bow his head to the English, and he was slain in an ambush, probably in 1291. His death left his son William with a smouldering resentment for the English, which in time turned to implacable hatred. Circumstances had led young William to abandon the ecclesiastical path he had been set onto. It was almost time for him to rely on his skill with the claymore. The first time he crossed swords with the English was soon after his father's death. At this point, Wallace was a young man of probably 20. One day, he was walking around the town where his maternal uncle was the sheriff, wearing brilliant green. Please do remember he was 2 meters tall, when he got accosted by an English asking, and I quote, "Why in the devil are you wearing such a gay garment?" The Englishman then proceeded to ask Wallace for the blade he was wearing at his waist. Wallace's response was swift and very dramatic. Grabbing the Englishman by the collar, he drew his blade and thrust it through his assailant's heart. The Englishman had not come alone, but Wallace dispatched most of his attackers before fleeing. With the town in high alert, it would have been almost impossible for Wallace to get away safely, but by chance he happened upon his uncle's housekeeper, who promptly opened their house to him, bundled him in a gown of hers, placed a wimple and a match on his head, gave him some wool, and told him to crouch down in the corner and pretend to spin. It must have been quite a sight, but according to the sources, the ruse worked, and by nightfall, Wallace was finally free to leave town. Knowing that he wasn't safe there, he moved away to another uncle who had opened his door to him. Whenever he went, though, it seemed that like trouble would follow him. As he was fishing near his uncle's home, he was approached by 5 English knights who demanded he give them the fish. When Wallace refused, they attacked him. Even without weapons, Wallace managed to snatch a sword from them and kill 3 of the knights. Once again, Wallace was forced to leave his home. This time, though, with only his young page with him, he decided to make the forest his new home. From this point on, Wallace lived some years as an outlaw, a sort of Scottish Robin Hood, mostly dedicated to killing the invaders rather than helping the poor. None of the stories of these years can be historically proven. It's true that Wallace spent some years as an outlaw, but I think most of his adventures have been greatly exaggerated, if not completely invented. In any case, his years as a bandit at the head of his own squad of desperados must have had a great impact both on his character and on his skills. It is probably in this period that he picked up the skills of generalship necessary to organize and lead a relatively large force against one of the best armies in Europe at the time. Of course, during this time, his resentment toward the English had only grown, and every occasion was a good one to try and diminish their numbers. According to the sources, it's one of these encounters that gave rise to a story, which gave Wallace a patina of legend, even during his lifetime. One day, as he was strolling through the same town he'd once escaped from, he saw a servant boy being harassed by the English. When Wallace interceded on behalf of the boy, he was attacked by the English, and through sheer weight of numbers, forced with his back to the wall. He was captured and thrown in a dungeon, where he was kept in appalling conditions and slowly weakened by starvation. The gaoler had been instructed to give him nothing but water and rotten herrings. It is no surprise that in these conditions, Wallace fell ill with a fever so bad that he hovered close to death. When, on the day of his trial, the door to his cell was opened, they found him in a deep coma. Thinking him already dead, the English threw his corpse over the wall in a dung heap, where he was left to rot. Fortunately for him, news of this reached the ears of a woman who had been Wallace's nursemaid. She went to the English and asked permission to take away his corpse to give him a decent burial. The English agreed, and she managed to get his body to her house. As she was cleansing him in preparation for the funeral, she noticed a faint flicker of his eyelids. For days she spoon-fed him, keeping the news of his continued existence on the down low. She even organized a fake wake and funeral to remove suspicion. Thanks to the help of his dedicated nursemaid, Wallace survived, effectively coming back from the dead. News of his resurrection spread far and wide, adding an aura of mystique to his character. His miraculous recovery even reached the ears of Thomas the Rhymer, the man who had foretold Alexander's death. He had told the king his horse would have been the death of him, and Alexander's third answer had been to kill his horse. Considering how he died in the end, maybe Sir Thomas hadn't been completely wrong. Upon being given the news, Sir Thomas made a prophecy on Wallace, stating he would be the one to bring Scotland to peace. Whether we want to believe in it or not, the truth is that this prophecy was the best bit of propaganda that could have ever happened to Wallace. Sir Thomas's prophecy about Alexander III had come true, so there was no reason to think his second one wouldn't come true as well. I'm sure that his prophecy gave Wallace a sense of his own destiny. He had survived everything the English had thrown at him, even coming back from the dead. He was invincible. This episode marks a turning point in Wallace's approach. Before, he'd been a lone maverick, striking solo against the English. But now, with the prophecy at his back, he had a broader purpose, reclaiming Scotland. Many youths came to him, inspired by his story, his personal magnetism and his charm. They weren't just outlaws anymore, but also good people, honest people. Soon enough, Wallace had formed a brigade with more than 50 men. One of the first things he did was exact his revenge from the knight who had killed his father. Attacking his convoy not only provided Wallace with the revenge he dreamt of, but also with quite a bounty of animals, provisions, wine, and money. Then he went around from castle to castle, from town to town, attacking and retreating, pillaging where he could, doing everything in his power to ruin any Englishman he came across. It is during this period that he allegedly met and fell in love with Marion Braidfoot, a young heiress. Not much is known about this courtship, with one chronicle attesting Wallace had promised to marry Marion when he had freed his country, another saying that he had indeed married her and had a daughter with her, and some modern historians claiming she never existed in the first place. If we choose to believe that Wallace did find love, we also have to be aware that his love was marred by tragedy. Unfortunately, Marion was brutally killed by the English as she was trying to help Wallace escape them. Some chronicles even state that Wallace, in disguise, had been a helpless witness of her murder. Whatever the truth, it's incontrovertible that Wallace was enraged. Chronicles say that the night he and his men slaughtered more than 240 English soldiers in revenge. The murder of an entire garrison shook the entire country. For the first time, the Scots were seeing that the English weren't that invincible after all. It was the year 1297. John Balliol, the puppet king, had resigned the year before after having lost his last battle against Edward I, and the King of England had compounded the humiliation for Scotland by removing the Stone of Destiny, the artifact on which centuries of Scottish kings had been crowned, and bringing it to Westminster Abbey. At this point, many aristocrats had started up their own rebellions against the English, but William Wallace was one of the only 2 Scottish commanders who had had any luck against them. The other was Andrew Moray. On the 11th of September 1297, Wallace and Moray met and united their forces to fight in one of the greatest battles in the history of Scottish independence, the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Therefore was John de Varenne, 6th Earl of Surrey, the same man who had already defeated the Scots in 1296 at Dunbar, John Balliol's last battle before his forced abdication in the same year. The castle of Stirling lied at the very heart of the kingdom, and it was of great strategic importance. The bridge in front of it was narrow, large enough for maybe 2 horses to pass by one another. An English victory would seal their dominance, but a Scottish one would open up the possibility of not only driving the English back, but also to reclaim Scotland. The Scots were prepared to risk everything under the banner of 2 unseasoned young generals who'd never seen a real battle. Their enemy counted in the tens of thousands, all veterans of other wars. But what the Scottish army lacked in preparation, numbers and leadership, it more than made up in spirit. They were motivated by patriotism. This was their chance to reclaim their land. As per chivalry rules, the English offered to withdraw if the Scots capitulated before the battle. Wallace's answer to the messenger was quite clear, and I quote, "Tell your people that we have not come here to gain peace, but are prepared for battle, to avenge and deliver our country. Let them come up when they like, and they will find us ready to meet them, even to their beards." And the Scots were really ready to meet the English. The infantry, perfectly coached by Wallace, stood firm as the English started to cross the bridge. Wallace knew that timing was essential. To call for a counterattack too soon or too late would mean losing everything. As he judged that enough English had crossed the bridge, Wallace sounded the attack. At once, the Scots surged forward, brandishing spears and swords and yelling like madmen. The heavy cavalry floundered and got stuck in the mud, and in the chaos, the Scots pushed back and gained the bridgehead. This caused panic in the English army. In the end, 100 knights on horseback, 300 Welsh archers, and all the 5,000 infantry which had crossed the bridge that day perished. The Scots gave no quarters. It was a humiliating defeat for the English, while the Scots had virtually no victims, except for their commander, Andrew Moray, who received a wound which would prove fatal some weeks later. The Scots' victory at Stirling was not a decisive victory, but it was important psychologically, because it was finally clear that the English weren't invincible. Edward I, King of England, until that moment known as the unbeatable Hammer of the Scots, would address the humiliation personally in the future, but in that moment it was William Wallace's turn to shine. He, a cadet son from a minor noble family, had succeeded where other men of nobler blood had failed. It was a hit on the English morale, but also on the concept of feudalism. Riding high on the victory, Wallace went into England, raiding the north. Unfortunately, such tactics didn't make a dent into England's main forces, leaving only the people in those territories to suffer unduly. After 3 months of raids, in December 1297, Wallace was back in Scotland, where he was knighted, we don't know by whom, but maybe by Robert Bruce, and was given the position and title of Guardian of Scotland. The Guardians had been the 6 people who had been nominated to stand as regents until Margaret, Alexander III's granddaughter, had reached majority. They had disbanded when John Balliol had taken the throne. Now the position was reinstated and given to William Wallace. He governed in the name of the absent king, who was technically still John Balliol. In theory, both the commanders who had won the Battle of Stirling should have been made guardians, but unfortunately Andrew Moray had succumbed to the wounds received in November. It's a bit weird to think that a nation which still upheld the concept of feudalism could give its highest office to basically a commoner. Maybe it wasn't so much that Wallace had been given the guardianship, but the fact that he had been the right man at the right time and with an army at his back, so nobody had said anything. Unfortunately for us, we lack the documents on the period in which Wallace was a guardian, so we don't really know what he did or how well he did it. To give what credit we can give, it has to be said that at a court in which intrigue and backstabbing were constant, Wallace did good, holding out for as long as he did, especially since he couldn't boast particularly useful connections. With his position hanging on his military prowess, Wallace kept engaging the English in small skirmishes. Edward I, who had come in person to Scotland to wipe away the stain of defeat, was confronted with an opposing army which suddenly attacked and just as suddenly retreated. These guerrilla tactics sapped the morale of the English, disrupted their supply lines, and brought them closer and closer to an ignominious retreat. And then, just as Edward I had been about to call quits on the entire business, his scouts spotted Wallace's army. They had come closer to the English, waiting for their chance to strike. For Edward I, this was a godsend. His enemy was finally in his reach. To be honest, Wallace had no intention of facing the English in a pitched battle. England's army outnumbers Scotland's probably 5-1, if not more. Wallace's tactics was to remain out of range, only picking at the back of the retreating army. With a night march the Scots hadn't foreseen, Edward I forced Wallace into the battle he had been avoiding, what would be later known as the Battle of Falkirk. To give credit where it's due, the Scots fought valiantly. Wallace had organised them in schiltrons. Do you remember when I told you that in a land far away from Macedonia someone would come up with the same formation as Philip II had? Well, Wallace's schiltrons were Scotland's version of the Macedonian phalanx. Their weapons were pikes and lances. It is said that at the beginning of the battle, Wallace encouraged his men with this phrase, "I've brought you to the ring, now dance as best as you can." And the Scots did their very best. Their schiltrons held firm against cavalry and infantry attacks. But then Edward I deployed his long-range squadrons. When archers, crossbowmen and slingers started pelting the schiltrons with projectiles, the Scots had nowhere to go. One by one they fell, until their forests of pikes were no more. In the end, just as Stirling had been Wallace's grand triumph, Falkirk was his bitter defeat. Wallace survived the battle, but with his military reputation in tatters, he was forced to resign the guardianship. We don't know where Wallace went after Falkirk. Some chronicles say he went to France, to be a mercenary there, but there is no evidence of his name anywhere in the French documents. Others say he remained in Scotland, going back to those guerrilla-style attacks that had brought him so much fortune at the beginning. Edward I's victory at Falkirk washed away the shame of Stirling, but the King of England would never forgive the Scot who had humiliated him so. There would never be a pardon for William Wallace. In the 6 years between 1299 and 1305, William Wallace and his band evaded capture while striking the English forces whenever they could. And then, on August 5th, 1305, Wallace was arrested near Glasgow, probably through betrayal, although we don't know who the traitor was. 2 weeks later, he was brought to London in front of Edward I. The King of England had already decided Wallace's fate. He had decided it years before when the Scot had humiliated him, but he had wanted to observe the judicial proprieties. And so, William Wallace was given a show trial. His crime? He was a traitor to the king. Wallace emphatically denied the charges. He said, and I quote, "I cannot be a traitor, for I owe him no allegiance. He is not my sovereign. He never received my homage, and whilst life is in this persecuted body, he shall never receive it. To the other points whereof I am accused, I freely confess them all." He was then condemned to be hanged, disembowelled while still alive, beheaded, and then drawn and quartered with his 4 limbs sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom. With Edward I's final vendetta ended William Wallace's life. He died as he has lived, faithful to his principles and free, at least in spirit. He, a cadet son of a minor noble, destined to a life of obscurity, had fought his way to the top, demonstrating to commoners and nobles alike that the nobility of spirit was more important than the nobility of blood. His triumphs had earned him a place in the history of Scotland. His sacrifice would not be in vain. Exactly 7 months later, Robert Bruce would be crowned King of Scotland as Scone. We have reached the end of another path today. As we have seen, William Wallace had sown a seed which another man would make sprout and flower. I will wait for you here in 2 weeks, when we will continue to travel Scotland to see how the seeds of freedom planted by Wallace would soon flower into a new dynasty on the Scottish throne. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me, Sarah Orfali, Doctor in History. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.